The year 1971 began in a turbulent world context. The Cold War between the two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, was at its peak. The competition between the two was spreading to every corner of the world. This competition was not only in arms, space, or diplomacy. It was also casting its shadow directly on the battlefield and in the financial system. Looking at South Asia, it can be seen that the long-standing resentment in East Pakistan over the state language and centralization of power in Pakistan was finally turning into a burning fire. The Awami League, led by Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, won a landslide victory in the general elections held in December 1970. But the political and military leadership of West Pakistan refused to accept it. As a result, the situation took a terrible turn in March 1971. March 25, 1971, this night is a terrible black night in history. The Pakistani military carried out a massacre throughout the city of Dhaka according to a plan called Operation Searchlight. No university, student dormitory, journalist or intellectual was spared. This was the beginning of the struggle for the survival of the people of East Bengal. Then on March 26, 1971, Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman declared independence. A huge People's Liberation War began. Thousands of people started organizing in villages and towns. The Mukti Bahini was formed. Training camps were set up on the Indian border. Meanwhile, Indian Prime Minister Indira Gandhi intensified diplomatic efforts to protest the barbarity of West Pakistan. Millions of refugees crossed the border and took refuge in India. India was forced to become directly involved in the humanitarian disaster and security risks. West Pakistan and China were close allies at the time. The United States, under the Nixon administration, saw Pakistan as an important diplomatic bridge to establish relations with China. It was during this time that a secret visit was organized. National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger secretly traveled to Beijing via Islamabad, which was a turning point in the history of world politics. On the other hand, the Soviet Union stood by India. The Indo-Soviet Treaty of Friendship was signed in August. As a result, India began to prepare against Pakistani aggression with more confidence. This turbulent year of 1971 was a severe shock not only to South Asia, but also to the world financial system. On August 15, 1971, U.S. President Richard Nixon announced that gold could no longer be exchanged for dollars. The Bretton Woods system collapsed. The fiat currency system of the 21st century began, leading to global inflation, income inequality, and increasing financial uncertainty in the future. Meanwhile, resistance continued in Bangladesh. The guerrilla warfare tactics of the Mukti Bahini upset the West Pakistani army. Many former soldiers, students, women, everyone participated in this people's war. November. With the help of India, the combined command of the Mukti Bahini and the Indian Army, Mukti Bahini, was formed. They began to launch attacks in the border areas. Pakistan was desperate for help from international allies at this time. On December 3, 1971, Pakistan attacked the Indian air base. As a result, the Indian government officially declared war. The Third Indo-Pakistani War began. This war is recognized as one of the fastest wars in history, ending in 10 days. The year 1971 began in a turbulent world context. The Cold War between the two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, was at its peak. The competition between the two was spreading to every corner of the world. This competition was not only in arms, space, or diplomacy, it was also casting its shadow directly on the battlefield and in the financial system. Looking at South Asia, it can be seen that the long-standing resentment in East Pakistan over the state language and centralization of power in Pakistan was finally turning into a burning fire. The Awami League, led by Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, won a landslide victory in the general elections held in December 1970. But the political and military leadership of West Pakistan refused to accept it. As a result, the situation took a terrible turn in March 1971. March 25th, 1971. This night is a terrible black night in history. The Pakistani military carried out a massacre throughout the city of Dhaka according to a plan called Operation Searchlight. No university, student dormitory, journalist or intellectual was spared. This was the beginning of the struggle for the survival of the people of East Bengal. Then on March 26, 1971, Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman declared independence. A huge people's liberation war began. Thousands of people started organizing in villages and towns. The Mukti Bahini was formed. Training camps were set up on the Indian border. Meanwhile, Indian Prime Minister Indira Gandhi intensified diplomatic efforts to protest the barbarity of West Pakistan. Millions of refugees crossed the border and took refuge in India. India was forced to become directly involved in the humanitarian disaster and security risks. Meanwhile, the situation of the Pakistani army in Dhaka was gradually weakening. The Mukti Bahini started entering from different parts of the city. Finally, on December 16, 1971, the eastern commander of the Pakistani army, Lieutenant General Amir Abdullah Khan Niazi, surrendered to Indian Lieutenant General Jagjit Singh Arora at the racecourse Maidan in Dhaka. This was the largest military surrender since World War II. About 93,000 Pakistani soldiers surrendered. That day, a new independent state was born, Bangladesh. At that moment of independence, the sky of Bangladesh was filled with joy of victory as well as boundless pain. Although the 9-month war was over, it left behind a scarred country, a devastated society, and millions of grieving people. Villages burned by the Pakistani army, raped women, tortured children, and millions of unfortunate people. Only one word was on the lips of the people: freedom. But this independence did not come only across the country, but its shadows spread worldwide. The world was then looking towards South Asia, where a new state was born across a river of blood. But the recognition of this new state in the international arena began a complex diplomatic calculation. The United States at that time was under the administration of President Nixon. The United States' position was in favor of Pakistan, especially the close relationship of the then-ruler Yahya Khan with Washington. Nixon and his foreign policy architect Henry Kissinger believed that the United States' diplomatic success was to make a secret agreement with China through the mediation of Pakistan. They were reluctant to recognize Bangladesh so that the Pakistani government would not be completely isolated. Meanwhile, China itself was also against Bangladesh. When a resolution was raised against India and Bangladesh in the United Nations Security Council, China supported it. But the resolution was cancelled due to the Soviet Union's veto. China had only entered the United Nations at that time, so, by not recognizing Bangladesh, they maintained their pro-West Pakistan position. India, which provided the most diplomatic and military support, was sympathetic to the Prime Minister, Indira Gandhi, in many developing countries. This was because many began to see the war as a mass movement against imperialism. The Soviet Union stood firmly by India and quickly recognized Bangladesh. They believed that a new independent state needed to be created in the region to counterbalance the unilateral policies of the Western powers. West Pakistan and China were close allies at the time. The United States, under the Nixon administration, saw Pakistan as an important diplomatic bridge to establish relations with China. It was during this time that a secret visit was organized. National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger secretly traveled to Beijing via Islamabad, which was a turning point in the history of world politics. On the other hand, the Soviet Union stood by India. The Indo-Soviet Treaty of Friendship was signed in August. As a result, India began to prepare against Pakistani aggression with more confidence. This turbulent year of 1971 was a severe shock not only to South Asia, but also to the world financial system. On August 15, 1971, U.S. President Richard Nixon announced that gold could no longer be exchanged for dollars. The Bretton Woods system collapsed. The fiat currency system of the 21st century began, leading to global inflation, income inequality, and increasing financial uncertainty in the future. Meanwhile, resistance continued in Bangladesh. The guerrilla warfare tactics of the Mukti Bahini upset the West Pakistani army. Many former soldiers, students, women, everyone participated in this people's war. November. With the help of India, the combined command of the Mukti Bahini and the Indian Army, Mukti Bahini, was formed. They began to launch attacks in the border areas. Pakistan was desperate for help from international allies at this time. On December 3, 1971, Pakistan attacked the Indian air base. As a result, the Indian government officially declared war. The Third Indo-Pakistani War began. This war is recognized as one of the fastest wars in history, ending in 10 days. The year 1971 began in a turbulent world context. The Cold War between the two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, was at its peak. The competition between the two was spreading to every corner of the world. This competition was not only in arms, space, or diplomacy, it was also casting its shadow directly on the battlefield and in the financial system. Looking at South Asia, it can be seen that the long-standing resentment in East Pakistan over the state language and centralization of power in Pakistan was finally turning into a burning fire. The Awami League, led by Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, won a landslide victory in the general elections held in December 1970. But the political and military leadership of West Pakistan refused to accept it. As a result, the situation took a terrible turn in March 1971. March 25th, 1971. This night is a terrible black night in history. The Pakistani military carried out a massacre throughout the city of Dhaka according to a plan called Operation Searchlight. No university, student dormitory, journalist or intellectual was spared. This was the beginning of the struggle for the survival of the people of East Bengal. Then, on March 26, 1971, Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman declared independence. A huge People's Liberation War began. Thousands of people started organizing in villages and towns. The Mukti Bahini was formed. Training camps were set up on the Indian border. Meanwhile, Indian Prime Minister Indira Gandhi intensified diplomatic efforts to protest the barbarity of West Pakistan. Millions of refugees crossed the border and took refuge in India. India was forced to become directly involved. Thus, the birth of Bangladesh took place amidst the polarization of world politics. It was not just the independence of a country, but the emergence of a new pawn on the strategic map of the Cold War. Meanwhile, bloodshed began within Pakistan, not just on the battlefield but at the heart of politics. President Yahya Khan, who had committed genocide in East Pakistan under his dictatorship, was removed. Zulfikar Ali Bhutto came to power. He took office as president and later became prime minister. Bhutto's first challenge was to restore a national identity to the country's psychologically devastated and militarily defeated state. On the one hand, he denied Bangladesh's independence, while on the other hand, he tried to maintain a balance between the powerful leftist and religious forces in West Pakistan. After Bangladesh's independence, a new chapter of national sorrow began in Pakistan, the defeat of 71. The Hamidur Rahman Commission report was formed to investigate the reasons for this defeat, blaming corruption within the army, political repression, and colonial behavior. In addition, conflicts between the army and politicians began in Pakistan, the shadow of which later reached the military coup of General Zia-ul-Haq in 1977. At that time, a struggle for reconstruction was underway in Bangladesh. The new government was under extreme pressure to rebuild a destroyed economy, railways, bridges, electricity systems, and educational institutions. Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman had returned to the country from Pakistani captivity. Millions of people took to the streets of Dhaka to welcome him. But this reconstruction was impossible without foreign aid. Therefore, Bangladesh began to receive recognition and assistance from different countries of the world, one by one. Within January-March 1972, India, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, Egypt, Algeria, etc., recognized Bangladesh. The United States recognized Bangladesh much later. On April 8, 1972, after various diplomatic tensions, China still did not recognize it. Meanwhile, the financial decision of 1971, Nixon's announcement to close the gold window, sent shockwaves through global markets. Exchange rates began to float. The dollar was no longer backed by gold but by trust in the government. This set the stage for global inflation and the subsequent oil crisis of 1973. And at this time, another major turning point in the events of 1971. Tensions between Israel and Arab countries in the Middle East began to rise. This had a direct impact on world markets, especially in energy and diplomacy. 2021 was therefore not just a year of war, a year of independence, or a year of financial decision. It was a combination of many levels of turbulent change, the echoes of which can still be heard worldwide today. The bloody events of 1971 were not limited to military or diplomatic calculations. This year was a year of immense humanitarian catastrophe, in which the lives of millions of people were changed forever. The massacres, rapes and burning of homes by Pakistani forces, especially in Bangladesh, resulted in a horrific humanitarian tragedy that many historians consider one of the greatest human rights violations of the 19th century. History of torture. On the night of March 25th, the Pakistani army indiscriminately killed students, teachers, poets, intellectuals, and journalists in various halls and areas of Dhaka University. After that, the army operation gradually spread throughout East Bengal. From cities to villages, there was no safe place. There was especially military hatred towards the Hindu community and the identity of the Bengali nation. To justify this policy of repression in East Pakistan, the Pakistani government used its own propaganda machine to try to misinform the world. However, the news and evidence collected by independent journalists and foreign diplomats around the world at that time shook the world's conscience. The New York Times, The Guardian, Time magazine, and even some of Pakistan's own journalists, such as Anthony Mascarenhas, went abroad and leaked information about the genocide committed by the Pakistani government. All this created sympathy for the liberation war around the world. The refugee crisis was one of the most humanitarian disasters of 1971. About 10 million people took refuge on the Indian border, one of the largest refugee flows in history. Camps spread across India's border states. These camps were rife with food shortages, disease, and insecurity. The Indian government was struggling to cope with the pressure, but was still forced to shelter them on humanitarian grounds. The cries of these refugees spread through the world media. US Congress members and famous intellectuals also expressed their opinions on the Bangladesh issue at that time. World-famous singer George Harrison and scholar Ravi Shankar organized the Concert for Bangladesh, which was the first large humanitarian concert in history. Through this concert held in New York, the Bangladesh independence movement received widespread international publicity and raised funds for the war-torn people. The new state and political reality, even after gaining independence in December 1971, Bangladesh did not find complete peace. After the war, numerous unidentified graves, burned houses, collapsed bridges, and signs of looting were found across the country. Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman knew that not only independence, but also the reconstruction of a nation would be the biggest battle of his life. He returned and took the initiative to formulate a new constitution. In a very short time, at the end of 1972, Bangladesh adopted a constitution with secular, democratic and socialist principles. This was rare in the world at that time, a war-torn country was able to formulate a complete constitution in just 1 year. But the problem was the economy. The resources received from Pakistan were at zero. The conditions of electricity, food, health, and education were deplorable. And at that time, the relationship between the locals and the Bahari population returning from West Pakistan was becoming sour. Many of them had sided with the Pakistani forces during the Liberation War, resulting in a vengeful attitude. This instability became more complicated by the issue of the trial of war criminals. The Bangladesh government took the initiative to try war criminals and in 1972 created the International Crimes Tribunal Act, but many trials were halted due to various obstacles at the international level and subsequent political pressure. International geopolitics and reaction to the war. Meanwhile, the army in Pakistan was reeling after the defeat in the war. Zulfikar Ali Bhutto renewed his emphasis on diplomacy, and in 1972 the similar agreement was signed with India, which secured the release of 93,000 Pakistani prisoners of war. Indian Prime Minister Indira Gandhi played a strategic role in the similar agreement. She wanted to establish long-term peace in South Asia, but Bhutto later broke that promise and became vehement again on the Kashmir issue. The economic crisis of 1971 was still hitting the world. After the collapse of the Bretton Woods system, the dollar depreciated and countries were forced to give up their gold reserves one by one. At the same time, OPEC members raised oil prices, triggering a crisis in the world market, which later led to a global oil crisis and inflation in 1973. China was not walking its own path of reform at that time. Under the leadership of Mao Zedong, China was in the final stages of the Cultural Revolution. China did not establish any relations with Bangladesh due to its support for Pakistan. Even though Bangladesh sought membership in the United Nations, China vetoed it. As a result, Bangladesh's entry into the United Nations was delayed until 1974. Although 1971 had ended, its echoes continued in the hearts of every nation, in the policies of every state, and in the vortex of world politics for many years. The birth of Bangladesh was not just the liberation of a territory, but rather the beginning of a great social, cultural, and diplomatic revolution in South Asia. The first government and state reconstruction of Bangladesh. When Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman returned home on January 10, 1972, after being released from Pakistan, the entire nation welcomed him, but the task was extraordinarily difficult. A stable administration, a transparent judiciary, secure communications, and a food supply system were needed to create an overall framework for a devastated state. The then interim President Syed Nazrul Islam and Prime Minister Tajuddin Ahmed jointly ran the wartime government in exile in 1971, and after independence, Mujib's government began state building on that foundation. Their first step was to draft a secular, socialist, democratic and nationalist constitution. The Bangladesh Constitution was adopted on 4th November 1972 and came into effect on 16th of December, one of the fastest constitutions in history. Economic challenges and foreign aid. Bangladesh's economy was in ruins. The way Pakistan had exploited the eastern part, its industries, railways, electricity, banking and communication systems were almost non-existent. A relief and rehabilitation process began under the auspices of the United Nations and with the support of India. Relief and loans began to flow from the United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, Japan, and other countries. But this economic aid was not readily available because Pakistan had not yet recognized Bangladesh, and many Western countries were hesitant on that pretext. As a result, international commercial banks were also reluctant to deal. Finally, when Pakistan and Bangladesh faced each other at the Organization of Islamic Cooperation (OIC) summit in February 1974, Pakistan formally recognized Bangladesh's independence. Since then, the door to global recognition has been fully opened. Reaction and complications in world politics. The 1971 war became another reflection of international polarization. India's agreement with the Soviet Union and the closeness of China-Pakistan-US, all of which made South Asia a major strategic area. The Watergate scandal broke out within the United States. President Nixon's leadership began to be questioned. During this time, many U.S. policymakers also began to question the policy of military cooperation with Pakistan. U.S. Congressman Senator Edward Kennedy spoke out in favor of Bangladesh. He visited refugee camps during the war and took a stand against the genocide. His report, Crisis in South Asia, shook U.S. policy, and under moral pressure from around the world, the U.S. was forced to recognize Bangladesh. Oil crisis and new drama in the Middle East. It was during this time that the Middle East began to be turbulent. The conflict between Arab countries with Israel reached its peak, which led to the Yom Kippur War of 1973, and OPEC reduced oil production. This resulted in an oil crisis, inflation, and economic crisis worldwide. The birth of this crisis took place in 1971 when the US dollar was separated from the gold standard and the exchange rate floated on the world market. As a result, OPEC countries considered the dollar worthless and increased the exchange rate of oil. At this time, new states like Bangladesh suffered even more because they needed additional foreign currency to import oil, food, and medicine. Cultural explosion and memories of the Liberation War. After independence in Bangladesh, an unprecedented creative explosion was seen among writers, poets, painters, and playwrights. The painful stories of the Liberation War spread in plays, novels, poems, songs, and films. Salauddin Zaki, Satyajit Ray, Zahir Raihan, Taslima Nasrin, Sunil Gangopadhyay. All of them have written about the memory of 1971. During this time, the Shaheed Minar, the Independence Memorial Museum, and various organizations related to the Liberation War were established. But along with this, political tension began. Student movements, the rise of leftists, and the rapid, centralized governance of the Mujib government. At one stage, steps like the formation of the Rakshi Bahini increased political instability. In the aftermath of 1971, a war harder than war began within the country, and that was the war of state-building, nation-building, and the establishment of justice. As great as the achievement of independence was, its subsequent reality was thorny. Although Bangladesh emerged as a new state after the bloody war of 1971, another long struggle awaited it: experience in running the state, economic survival, maintaining foreign relations, and above all, keeping the nation united. The reality of freedom fighters and war casualties. Although the country was independent, the freedom fighters found a new flag amidst the ruins. This war-torn country was then in crisis with food grains, failed in employment, weak in infrastructure, and inexperienced in politics. The blood of about 3 million martyrs, the honor of more than 200,000 women, the experience of 10 million refugees, all of it combined to create a time of self-identity search across the country. Many freedom fighters returned with burning wounds, severed limbs or blind eyes. Although the government tried to rehabilitate them, many people were deprived of respect and help due to the weakness of the state structure. Rehabilitation and opposition to Bengali nationalism. In independent Bangladesh, the main political party was the Awami League. Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman was the most acceptable leader of the people. But in the post-independence reality, a terrible conflict arose. How can a struggling nation be made into a governable citizenry? The ideological conflict between the leftists during the Liberation War and the Mujib government began. The Jatiya Samajtantrik Dal, JSD, which emerged as an organization of young and revolutionary students and youth, directly demanded revolution and radical socialism against Bangabandhu's leadership. Government mismanagement, corruption, extortion, and anarchy increased everywhere in education, land reform, and the judiciary. Anger grew among the common people, which later led to a serious political crisis. Bangladesh's recognition in the world and inclusion in the United Nations. Bangladesh did not become a member of the United Nations in 1971 and 1972 due to opposition from China and Pakistan. China vetoed it several times. With the help of India, the Soviet Union, and Eastern European countries, Bangladesh's international profile continued to grow. Finally, in September 1974, Bangladesh was accepted as the 136th member state of the United Nations. Bangabandhu delivered a speech in Bengali at the United Nations in New York, the first Bengali speech ever given at the United Nations, which became a symbol of Bangladeshi nationalism. Political instability and one-party rule. Famine struck in 1974, floods, mismanagement of stockpiles, bureaucratic corruption, and the collapse of the agrarian economy. Many claim that about 1.5 million people died of starvation. This famine further pressured the government. Gradually, political opposition took the form of anti-state movements. Extremist leftist parties became involved in murder, kidnapping, and militant activities. In such a situation, Bangabandhu introduced a one-party rule in January 1975 called Bakshal. All political parties were abolished and a national party was formed, newspapers were closed, and only 4 newspapers were kept under government control. The aim was to ensure development by centrally managing the state. But, as a result, political opponents were silenced, opposition leaders were imprisoned, and resentment arose within the military-civilian bureaucracy. Deep conspiracy and the Beginning of national disaster. While Bangabandhu was busy trying to build a new state according to his ideals, the seeds of conspiracy were born among some disgruntled military officers. They felt that the country was going in the wrong direction, and the achievements of the Liberation War were under threat. On August 15, 1975, just 3.5 years later, the most shameful chapter in Bangladeshi history occurred. Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman and most of his family members were assassinated in Dhanmondi, Dhaka. This assassination was not just the death of a head of state, it was the successful implementation of a long-term plan by the anti-independence clique of Bangladesh. In light of the previous episodes, why is 1971 important? Let us return to the center of 1971 here. This year is a milestone not only in Bangladesh, but in the entire history of the world. It was the year of the birth of a new nation. Before 1971, there had never been a state called Bangladesh on the world map. It was the rise of a communal and anti-racist nationhood where a country was formed on the basis of language and culture, not religion. It was a year of tensions in world politics and confrontation of military alliances. The alliance of India and the Soviet Union against the United States and China became clear. For it was one of the most shameful genocides of humanity, where the conscience of history has given its verdict even without going to the international court. It was the ultimate sign of a nation's sacrifice and heroism, where millions of martyrs wrote the proudest identity of history with their blood. August 15, 1975 is a black day in the history of Bangladesh. But this massacre was not just the result of an incident, it was a vengeful reaction against the ideology and implementation of the 1971 war. Those who were on the side of Pakistan, those who denied the Liberation War, became active again in post-Mujib Bangladesh. State catastrophe after the assassination of Bangabandhu. After Bangabandhu was killed, state power passed to Khandakar Mushtaq Ahmed. This Mushtaq was a minister in the provisional government during the Liberation War, but he was accused of secretly maintaining contact with Pakistan and the United States. He took power with the help of some young army officers. Then, as his first act, he issued the Indemnity Ordinance, giving legal protection to Bangabandhu's killers, so that this murder would never be tried. A division arose in the army. One side was in favor of Khandakar Mushtaq and the killers, the other side was in favor of the spirit of the Liberation War. During the following period, several coups took place within the army, which repeatedly pushed Bangladesh back from a stable state. The rise of Ziaur Rahman and political reorganization. In November 1975, Mushtaq lost power in another coup. Then, the deputy chief of the army, Major General Ziaur Rahman, gradually took over state power. Zia was a freedom fighter, but his political philosophy was completely different from Bangabandhu's. Leaving the strength of the Liberation War behind, he imposed military rule. He introduced the concept of Bangladeshi nationalism, which was a repetition of the Pakistani trend. He lifted the ban on war criminal parties like Jamaat-e-Islami. He formed the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, BNP, as a political party. He brought some liberalization in journalism and the economy, but suppressed political opposition. It was during his tenure that the political rehabilitation of war criminals began. Those who had once called the birth of Bangladesh illegal began to return as ministers, MPs, judges, and diplomats. Changes in world politics and Bangladesh. During this time, changes also began in world politics. In 1979, the Soviet-Afghan War began. The United States, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia came together to form the Mujahideen group against Russia's invasion of Afghanistan. Although Bangladesh was not a direct ally in the Afghan war, it had an impact on domestic politics. The rise of Islamism, increased funding for madrasa education, and the expansion of Middle East-based NGOs, all of these gave new strength to Islamist groups. Assassination of Ziaur Rahman in 1981. Ziaur Rahman was killed in a military coup in Chittagong on May 30th, 1981. This proved once again that the state apparatus of Bangladesh was still unstable and hesitant. After his death, trials were held, many army officers were hanged, but uncertainty continued to grow in politics. Army Chief Hussein Muhammad Ershad gradually took over political power. Ershad's military rule and withdrawal from the Liberation War. In 1982, Ershad assumed state power in a bloodless coup. His rule was based on direct military rule, encouraging religion-based politics, attempting to remove the content of the Liberation War from national identity. In 1988, Ershad declared Islam the state religion, which was completely contrary to the constitutional spirit of Bangladesh. The moral foundation of the freedom fighters began to crumble. The real history of the War of Independence was omitted from textbooks, and pro-Pakistan ideology entered education and administration. Cultural resistance and new awakening. In spite of all this, ordinary people, cultural activists, journalists, playwrights, poets, they did not give up. A new cultural awakening began in the 1980s and 1990s. Independence, Ekator, Mukti Judo, these words returned again in songs, plays, books, and on stage. Charan Natyadal, Udichi, Swadhina Pathayatra. These reminded people of history on the streets. The new generation began to know what happened in 1971, why it happened. Mass movement and return to democracy. A massive mass movement began in 1990 against Ershad's dictatorship. It was led by the Chhatra Union, Chhatra League, Chhatra Dal, and all organizations in favor of the War of Liberation. Ershad was forced to resign in December 1990. Bangladesh returned to a democratic system. A new democratic chapter began with general elections in 1991. The legacy of 1971 still relevant today. More than 40 years have passed, but 1971 is still at the center of Bangladesh's nationhood, politics and diplomacy. On the one hand, this year is a symbol of sacrifice and victory. On the other hand, it is a warning. even after achieving independence, it must be constantly defended. As long as this country exists, the history of 1971 will be its backbone, where the blood of millions of martyrs, the cries of 200,000 women, and the helpless suffering of millions of people will remain alive. In the history of Bangladesh, 1971 is not an event. It is a process, a struggle, an ideal. It began with the uprising of Bengalis against colonial rule and culminated in a bloody war of independence, but the struggle did not end even after the war. Attempts to erase the history of 1971. During the period 1975-1990, various governments, especially military rulers, tried to distort and suppress the history of the Liberation War. The real history of the Liberation War was omitted from textbooks. The murderers and razakars of 1971 were rehabilitated in politics, except for Shahid Janani Jahanara Imam and a few fearless individuals like her. The freedom fighters were almost neglected. Many martyred families hid their identities because the razakars were at the peak of power at that time. But history cannot be suppressed forever. At one point, the struggle to regain the Liberation War began in Bangladesh. The Ghatak Dalal Nirmal Committee for the Eradication of 1971 and the Mass Movement. In 1992, the Ghatak Dalal Nirmal Committee for the Eradication of 1971 was formed, under the leadership of Shahid Janani Jahanara Imam. This organization began the symbolic trial of war criminals by setting up mass courts across the country. Thousands of people responded to their call. The trial was going on stage, but no case had been filed in the actual court yet. Even then, pressure was created in politics through this symbolic trial. When the Awami League came to power in 1996, steps were taken to bring back the history of the Liberation War, but due to political opposition and the complexity of the judicial structure, it was not possible to implement the trial of war criminals. Rediscovering 1971 in the 21st century. In 2009, the Awami League came to power again. This time they announced that the war criminals of 1971 would be tried. The International Crimes Tribunal was formed. This tribunal began the trial of cases on charges of war crimes for the first time. Those accused in the first phase: Ghulam Azam, former Amir of Jamaat-e-Islami; Mir Qasim Ali Ahsan Muhammad, Mujahid Sayyidi, Qamaruz Zaman Selim, Matiur Rahman Nizami. Many of them were sentenced to death and were carried out. This trial created a new historical chapter in Bangladesh. The justice of the martyrs' sacrifice was established. However, the international reaction was mixed. India supported the trial. The Pakistani government expressed concern and sided with the killers. Human rights organizations questioned the transparency of the trial process. But the people of Bangladesh said, even after 42 years, we want justice to triumph. The international significance of 1971. One thing is clear: 1971 was not just the birth of a country, it changed the perspective of world politics. Human rights and war crimes. Bangladesh proves that war criminals will face justice one day or another. no matter how hard they try. UN silence and controversy. The UN did not take any effective action against the genocide in Pakistan in 1971. This indifference is still a matter of criticism today. The power of the media. Western journalists, such as Simon Dring, Anthony Mascarenhas, showed the world the brutality of Pakistan with their reports. Without them, the world might never have known the horrors of East Bengal. Women and war. Bangladesh's war history is a brutal document of women's oppression. This proves internationally that war is not just military but also the most vulnerable. Sections of society are its victims. Why is the Liberation War still relevant? How does the new generation of Bangladesh today, those born in 2000 or later, view 1971? 1. Pride of history. 2. The basis of the nation's identity. 3. The focus of political division. 4. The ultimate test of human rights. The truth that should not be forgotten. 1971 is not just a war of liberation, it is the purest proof of a nation's spirit, sacrifice, and regaining its rights. It is a war that began with weapons, but ended with the hoisting of the flag. Last words. This long history is written not only on the pages of books, but in the consciousness of every Bengali. No one gives freedom. It has to be snatched away. In 1971, Bengalis snatched that freedom with their blood. This is not just a year, but an eternal history, which will be proudly pronounced as long as Bangladesh exists. My golden